Hello, and welcome to Good Conversations. My name is Thompson Smith. We're talking again today with Dr. Steve Running of the University of Montana, one of the world's leading scientists on an issue of the greatest importance, not only to Montana, but to the entire planet: climate change and global warming. We've all noticed that our winters aren't what they used to be, and the heat this past summer was something none of us has ever seen in Montana. I've heard this issue raised and discussed by people from every background in our community: tribal elders, farmers and ranchers, natural resource professionals, loggers, hunters, fishermen. Professor Running heads the Numerical Pterodynamic Simulation Group at UM's College of Forestry and Conservation. Since 2004, he served as one of the lead authors for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the branch of the United Nations first established in 1988 to focus on this issue. On October 12, 2007, it was announced that the Nobel Peace Prize was being awarded jointly to the IPCC, including Dr. Running, and former Vice President Al Gore for their work on global warming. We're honored to have Steve Running with us again today in the studios of KSKC Public Television. Welcome, Dr. Running, and again, our congratulations to you. We need to pick up where we left off. Last time you described briefly how the greenhouse effect works, what the evidence is for global warming, the evidence for human causation of global warming, and we began to discuss some of the impacts of global warming on our local area here. But before we return to impacts, I wanted you, if you could, to describe to viewers how the IPCC, the branch of the UN that you have contributed to and shared in the Nobel Peace Prize with the other members, how that body works, who is it composed of, and when someone comes up with some research or some findings, what kind of process occurs?
Right. First, the IPCC authors for the fourth assessment, the report that we wrote that came out last spring. Each author is appointed by their respective government. So someone in the U.S. government nominated me. I have no idea who it was. And myself and dozens of other scientists, about 130 countries participated, had scientists either as writers or reviewers. And overall, there were 400 authors worldwide that wrote this fourth assessment.
And how many scientists in the IPCC altogether? 400 authors, but is that?
Well, there's also reviewers. The IPCC ultimately is a very broad activity. There are climate modeling groups that ran the big climate models. There's authors, there's reviewers, both official government reviewers and unofficial reviewers for the documents. And so, while I say there was 400 authors of this fourth assessment of lead authors, it ripples larger and larger as you start to look at the activity as a whole.
And so, things that come out have been pretty thoroughly gone over by a lot of people at the top level of each specialty within climate science. Is that correct?
Yes, I started in 2004. All of us were appointed and had the first authors meeting and started writing first drafts. And our charge is to read the scientific literature. We only look at refereed, as we call it in science, refereed literature from prominent journals that have published papers from authors from anywhere, but only papers that are in these prominent journals have gone through peer review, so are considered to be legitimately evaluated science. And so we read, I think I probably read 600 or 700 papers. I ended up summarizing the results from about 50 of those papers in the piece I wrote. And I think other authors, it's a similar thing. You read many, many hundreds of papers. You write your text, which is then reviewed And we actually went through 3 cycles of review and rewrite and review and rewrite and edit and adjust again. So that if anything, the IPCC document is a little conservative, because anything that can't be absolutely documented from formal research literature just is thrown out because a reviewer will complain about it.
So, I mean, that's kind of the tendency of science, the way peer-reviewed science works anyway. It tends to be fairly conservative, is that right?
Well, I think this is the fundamental tenet of the scientific method, is whenever you think you've learned something new about anything, for it to be formal science, you have to write your results. You have to write about the instrument you measured it with, the analysis you did, how you drew your conclusions, and then other scientists get to read that line by line, and you have to convince them that what you did was rigorous. And if you can't convince them of that, then the journals won't publish the paper.
I see. Okay, and in our first half hour, we were talking a bit about the rate of growth in CO2 emissions, these tipping points, and James Hansen of NASA gave that recent presentation at the University of Montana, and you hosted him, and a packed room, packed audience, and most of his lecture was really about Earth history. It wasn't about computer modeling. It was more about these changes that have been documented by geologists and other scientists that go back tens of millions, hundreds of millions, even billions of years. Can you summarize just a piece of that for us that you think would be important for people to understand in terms of global warming?
I wish I was Jim Hansen, but I can give it a go.
He doesn't have a Nobel Peace Prize yet.
What Jim's own science has concentrated in as part of this larger issue, he does direct one of the big climate modeling groups, but what got him into this science originally was looking at correlations and timing between variations in CO2 through Earth history and variations in temperature. And so this is a very clear trend that temperature and CO2 go up and down in parallel. Now, they don't go instantaneously up and down because there's a lot of dynamics and feedbacks in the Earth system. We've already talked a good bit about one of them, and that is the coverage of ice and snow on the planet that goes through cycles as it's driven by increasing CO2. And so these correlations may take place over thousands of years in normal Earth history, but they're clear correlations that you can track for millions of years. These two variables have something to have some connection together, no doubt.
And over the course of the Earth's history, oftentimes those natural variations have to do with changes in the Earth's wobble or tilt in relation to the sun. Is that what Dr. Hansen was explaining?
Well, when we look at the causes of the natural variation, some of it is orbital dynamics, wobbles in the Earth's axis, major volcanoes. I mean, Mount St. Helens was peanuts by global volcano standards. When you look in geologic history, I mean, you should have been around when Yellowstone went off or something like that. Even meteorite strikes. So there's sources and triggers of natural variability that we think we understand pretty well, and some of them are these very
cataclysmic events
that show up in the geological record. Even things like the continents weren't in the same place. When you go back millions of years,
tectonic
movements. The tectonic plate movement means that that the continents weren't in the same place. So when you get far, far back into history. You can't use those exact temperatures to relate to today's temperatures, because the system in multiple ways was in a different state. But you can study how temperature and CO2 operate in common. And that's what Dr. Hansen is a world expert on.
And the other important point that I took from his lecture, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was that except for those cataclysmic events, the natural variations in climate tend to be weak forcings, I think was the term he used, of temperature change and CO2 levels, and that they're much weaker than the strong forcings that we're observing today with human-caused CO2 emissions from the burning of coal and oil.
Right, right. I know one of the examples he gives that I think is pretty helpful for people is he talks about changing the Earth's radiation balance by 2 watts per meter squared. Well, 2 watts is a Christmas light bulb. And so it doesn't sound like much, but imagine a Christmas light bulb on every square meter, which is about the size of this table, every square meter of the entire Earth's surface. And you realize that what's occurring is a tiny little fractional change in this energy balance, but accumulated over the entire planet's surface year after year after year.
It's an enormous amount.
It's an enormous,
cumulatively,
ultimate amount of energy, even though the initial change in this radiation balance is measured in tenths or even hundredths of a watt per meter squared.
Interesting. Well, we'll continue in one moment. We'll take a quick break here. Don't go anywhere. And we're back, having a good conversation with Dr. Steve Running of the University of Montana, who shared this past year in the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on global warming with other members of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and former Vice President Al Gore. Thanks for being here again, Dr. Running. Let's get right to some discussion, some more discussion about what the likely or expected impacts may be right here in Montana. I'd like to ask you again to begin with snowpack and then the issue of water, which has always been a big one in Montana.
Right. When I sort through the impacts that I think are going to make the biggest difference to Montanans, I think it's about water and wildfire. Simple as that. There's going to be other changes, other impacts already underway, but I think there'll be things that we can react to reasonably well. But when it comes to water and wildfire, I think it's going to be tough, and already is. We've historically been able to use this winter snowpack as just a free storage reservoir. It works great. It sits up there in the mountains all winter long, and about the time we need the water in the spring and summer, it melts and comes down the river, and there we go. And we're just plain losing that free storage mechanism. Little by little, we're having less snowpack, and it's melting, as I said earlier, 2 to 4 weeks earlier. And the big thing is, in 50 more years, we think it'll be another 2 to 4 weeks earlier. And so we may, in the Flathead Basin, be having our spring snowmelt starting in mid-February.
And are those projections still holding, or as more evidence comes in, are they actually Is the news getting even maybe a little more dire?
That isn't changing fast enough that we can tell how that there's any acceleration in those trends, at least from the statistical records. And so I think those are still pretty good estimates for now. Mm-hmm. But I think what we need to expect is that, number one, the snowpack will melt and come down through our river systems earlier and earlier in the spring. Mm-hmm. It's then going to be harder to have that water available come the late summer. Mm-hmm. And I think our stream levels are already struggling in the late summer, July and August. Right. Look at how many of our streams, Fish and Game, had to close for fishing because the water flow was too low, the temperature's too hot, the dissolved oxygen insufficient. And we had weeks and weeks of stream closure last summer, for example. And I just think that type of trend in our seasonal water supply is going to continue, and we just have to be ready for it and be planning for it. And then it's the second issue, as I've stated, is wildfire. And we're seeing longer wildfire seasons. In fact, it was just astonishing. There was a wildfire east of Billings 2 days ago. Here we are in early January, and they were having a wildfire.
Wow.
And
so we could end up with a year-round fire season.
We virtually are at that point already, that at least somewhere in the state on the east side they had a wildfire in mid-November, if I remember right, and now here we have another one in early January. And so I think our season is getting longer, and we will have more fires. One thing we just have to face up to is every once in a while one of these fires is going to get so big it's unstoppable. Mm-hmm. And I read the book on the 1910 fires last summer at the peak of our fire season, just to get a sense of how bad it could get. And you can never predict when all the wrong combinations come together for that sort of holocaust, but I'm afraid our probabilities of really big fires are just inching up bit by bit.
And you know, one of the impacts too, as I understand it, that I'd like to ask you about, you know, as the streams dry up faster, as water levels decline faster, as water temperatures get warmer, right, there's going to be a lot of impacts on fish, aren't there? I mean, this last summer we saw a big die-off of Arctic grayling in a fishery up near Kalispell.
Yes, I learned something of my older daughter has moved to Tucson, and when you go to Arizona you see riverbeds with no water in it at all. And of course it's going to have virtually no aquatic ecosystem when there's no water. And I'm afraid our smaller streams of Montana may progressively in the next few decades completely dry out in the summer. And once that starts happening, the fisheries are gone for that stretch of river.
This past summer in Missoula, from what I understood, in July, their average daily high temperature was within a couple degrees of Tucson.
Yes.
Speaking of Tucson.
We had 11 days over 100 degrees last July in Missoula.
And some of these animals, fish or mammals or rodents that live at kind of the margins of either their territories or of elevation, the pikas up high, the grayling that are in Montana and nowhere else in the lower 48, those are the ones that'll be first at risk in Montana, is that right?
Well, I think so. I think, for example, our ungulate populations, deer, elk, antelope, they may do better because they will not experience the winter kill that they've had in the past. So at least for a few decades, some of our wildlife may be benefited by not having the harsh winter temperatures. But I think others of these that fit in very small niches that could change out from their habitat, change out from under them, they may really struggle.
Well, again, pressed by time, I'd like to move on to what we can do about this. I mean, in some ways, I kind of wonder, you know, if we're too late already. Will it make a difference what we do either as individuals or as a state or as a nation now?
Well, it might be too late already. We don't actually know. The Earth system is so large, and the changes and responses of the Earth system are sufficiently not understood that it might be that we've gone too far already. But I guess we ethically have no choice but to try. And really what we have to do is simply reduce carbon emissions in our energy systems. And so this is a challenge engineering and scientifically, but we can't just take oil and gas forever and just burn it and emit it into the atmosphere. We're really using the atmosphere as a free garbage can right now. And we learned with water pollution 40, 50 years ago that you can't do that forever. And now we're finding for the global atmosphere, we can't just use it as a free garbage can.
Well, you say now we're finding it, but you know, I have in my library at home a book that was published at the end of the Carter administration. In fact, it didn't come out until after Reagan had taken office in 1981. Published by the Council on Environmental Quality out of the White House, that was just called Environmental Trends, and it has graph after graph showing trends in all kinds of areas, and included in the end of the book is that famous graph from Mauna Loa showing CO2 levels rising. And there's a paragraph in there very clearly stating the concern about global warming.
Yeah.
And it seems like we've done nothing for a quarter century except make the problem worse.
Yeah. And in fact, Jim Hansen became a legend in earth science back in 1988 when he testified to Congress that global warming had already started. And most of us were not even willing to say that publicly yet. And Jim was there matter-of-factly telling Congress. And now when we look backward, we see he was right. And so we've wasted 20 years.
And it could be a critical 20 years. I mean, it seems like we have no time to waste.
I think that's true, that we've dallied on this for too long already. Other nations have at least turned the corner and started to get to work, and we need to get going on this, on just reducing carbon emissions.
And there is a
energy.
delayed effect, correct? I mean, carbon dioxide emitted decades ago is causing some of the warming we're seeing today. Is that right?
Right.
How long does it stay in the atmosphere?
Thousands of years.
Thousands of years.
Yeah.
Does it decline during that, over those thousands of years? At what point? I mean, if we took every action we could possibly reasonably do now, how long would it take to get CO2 levels back to their historic levels of 300 parts per million?
Tell you the truth, we can't even dream of bringing it back to 300. We're hoping we can cap it at somewhere between 400 and 450 is the best we can even imagine as earth scientists. And so, and when you think 400 is probably only about less than 20 years away at current rates of increase.
What's the single biggest step that could be taken in addressing this?
Well, the biggest step, and Jim Hansen made this very clear, the biggest step is we have to quit burning coal for electric energy.
I see. And how do we do that?
By finding other ways to generate electricity, and by doing a lot better at conservation of the electricity we use.
And when you say we, that means the whole world, because wherever it's emitted in the atmosphere, it has the same effect.
That's right. It's all one global atmosphere, and so not only do we as Americans have to make this transition, we then have to convince every other country on earth to make the transition. However, I'd say at this point, most all other countries are ahead of us in being willing to take action, and they're waiting for us.
One quick question from one of our community viewers, and as a note to the viewers, if you want to submit questions to us, please email me at goodtalk@blackfoot.net and you'll get onto our email list. But one question submitted by a viewer, his son asked, what can the current youth generation do to help stop global warming?
Well, I hope that the youth generation will be more able to make the kind of transitions needed, because I think we need to start at the top first with a lot of effort in conservation of electric power. We haven't even started trying yet to seriously conserve electric power. We have to think next about the kind of transportation we use and the kind of liquid fuels. Oil at this point is the basis of what everybody drives around on, and we have to transition out of burning oil for transportation. I think in the long run we'll probably need a very fundamental restructuring of our cities and towns, of how we live day to day, so it just isn't so energy intensive. And there's a lot of actually really exciting new thinking on more walkable and bike friendly towns, and more concentrated clusters where people don't have to live in their car for everything they do every day.
That's great. Well, it certainly seems that there's a rising consciousness about the issue, and the work you've done and Al Gore's done and many others has certainly helped in that. And we want to give you thanks for that. And thank you for coming in and taking the time with us today.
All right, thanks.
I want to thank Steve Running for taking this time today to help us better understand this crucial issue. And we want to encourage viewers to get informed and get involved. Here are a few websites providing good information on global warming and opportunities to take positive action. We welcome any comments, questions, or suggestions regarding our show. Please email me at goodtalk@blackfoot.net. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.